The American public are asking the Secretary of Defense, they're asking the President of the United States, they're asking their leadership for transparency, they're asking them for truth. And what I can tell you they're not getting is those things. Pete Hegseth lied about 150 young girls being killed in a bombing in Iran. That he lied about it. The President of the United States further lied about it. Right? That doesn't build any type of honesty.
In today's video, Bakari Sellers presses Scott Jennings on CNN's AC 360. History shows that some of the most important truths during wars, from the Vietnam War to post 9/11 reporting, came from journalists questioning the official narrative. A free press isn't supposed to act as a cheerleader for the government. Its job is to challenge power and make sure the public gets accurate information, especially when the stakes are this high. But before we dive into today's video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.
Then last night, the president wrote this 401-word post doubling down on the FCC threat. Quote, "I am so thrilled to see Brendan Carr, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, looking at the licenses of some of these corrupt and highly unpatriotic news organizations." Then took things a step further, accusing unspecified news organizations of running AI-generated video from the Iranian government. He wrote, "The story was knowingly fake, and in a certain way, you can say that those media outlets that generated it should be brought up on charges for treason for the dissemination of false information." Now, treason, I'll remind you, is punishable by death. He followed that with this on Air Force One.
I actually think it's pretty criminal because our media companies, who have no credibility whatsoever, are putting out information that they know is false, and it's a very dangerous thing for the country. I think they could be in serious jeopardy.
For more, I'm joined by CNN political commentator Bakari Sellers and CNN senior political commentator Scott Jennings. So, Bakari, for all the complaints about and threats against the media by the Trump administration, does this moment feel bigger to you when you have the government threatening during wartime to pull American news organizations off the air, even if that would be unconstitutional and likely go nowhere?
No, I think it should feel big. I think the American public should feel rattled about it, because what we're seeing fascism. We're seeing all those things that Republicans have told you, don't dare call us that. That is what we're seeing. And the fact is, Brendan Carr, for example, he's not even talking about Fox News, who just last week, during a dignified transfer, they used the wrong video to display Donald Trump. Instead of Donald Trump wearing a hat, being disrespectful of those military men and women, they used the literal wrong video of the dignified transfer from years ago. The same Fox News that actually got $780 some odd million in a settlement lied about the election. So let's actually call balls and strikes. And what we're seeing right now, the American public should actually be startled. They should be fearful. They should understand what is happening. Brendan Carr and Donald Trump and many others like him are actually going after the First Amendment. That is what we're seeing. And I must admit, it has been an amazing ploy. It's been very sound, but now they own TikTok, now they own X, now they own all of these other institutions that are putting forth and communicating our media platforms. And so that's the way Americans are consuming news. People should be afraid of that.
Scott Jennings, is it unpatriotic to say that 6 Americans were killed and identify who they are and talk about their lives?
No, it's not unpatriotic to report the news and report the facts. I think what the White House complaint is that in their view, there are a number of media outlets that are relentlessly anti-American. And also, I think and this is an ongoing issue, they are relentlessly concerned about people who take information out of classified memos or classified briefings.
Look, the bigger issue in that exchange isn't whether the media sometimes gets things wrong. Every newsroom in the country has made mistakes at some point. The real issue is what happens when the government starts threatening the press itself, especially during a war. That's exactly why the First Amendment exists in the first place. Historically, some of the most important reporting in American history came from journalists challenging the government during war wartime. The Pentagon Papers in 1971 exposed that multiple administrations had misled the public about the Vietnam War. At the time, the government argued that publishing those documents was dangerous and unpatriotic, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press because the public had the right to know the truth. If those reporters had been threatened with treason charges for publishing information that embarrassed the government, that story might never have come out. There's also the legal side of the FCC threat itself. Broadcast licenses aren't supposed to be used as a political weapon. The Communications Act of 1934, which created the FCC, was designed to prevent the government from controlling what journalists say on the air. In fact, courts have repeatedly ruled that the government cannot punish media organizations simply for coverage it doesn't like, because that would violate the First Amendment. And then there's the broader pattern here. Accusing journalists of treason or suggesting they could be shut down isn't normal political criticism. It's language that governments in less democratic countries often use to intimidate reporters. In the US, even during extremely tense moments like World War II or the Cold War, the government didn't routinely threaten news organizations with treason for publishing controversial stories.
And then present it in a certain way, is trying to put a negative spin on the war effort that they consider to be inaccurate. My personal view is everybody has responsibilities here. The government has responsibilities to be as transparent as possible with the American people without, of course, giving away any information that would help the enemy or put any soldiers in jeopardy. And the news media, I think, does have a responsibility to report the facts and be on top of the facts of the war, but not try to put it in a light that is just relentlessly negative for the purpose of simply hamstringing Donald Trump politically, which I think in some cases coverage has reflected that. So I think this is part of a longer ongoing issue. I think the White House view, Anderson, is that the war's going well. I mean, they're meeting all their military objectives, and they don't feel like that's being reflected in the mainstream coverage.
Right. But Corey, I mean, if you look back in history, there has been criticism of media's coverage of war by just about every government that's unhappy. I mean, you look at the Vietnam War, I've been reading a lot about books by Vietnam War correspondents just in the last couple of months. I mean, it is relentless attacks on the American media for reporting things which turned out to be true. Inflated body counts, things not going as well as the rosy picture that was often put on it. Isn't that the role of the media to report the facts?
I mean, respectfully, Anderson, I would say that your job now is more important than ever. I wasn't born during the Vietnam War, but I can tell you that this is probably apropos. This is something that a lot of people see parallels to. The American public are asking the Secretary of Defense, they're asking the President of the United States, they're asking their leadership for transparency, they're asking them for truth. And what I can tell you they're not getting is those things. Pete Hegseth lied about 150 young girls being killed in a bombing in Iran, that he lied about it. The President of the United States further lied about it, right? That doesn't build any type of honesty. The fact is, we're going to have to put boots on the ground because Scott knows this just as well as I do. You cannot actually destroy Iran's nuclear program by simply dropping missiles on top because of the way that they're buried into the earth.
Take Vietnam. For years, the government insisted the war was going well. But journalists on the ground reported something very different. Investigations later revealed things like inflated body counts and overly optimistic military briefings, which were meant to make progress look better than it actually was. That's exactly what led to the Pentagon Papers, which showed that multiple administrations had privately acknowledged the war was far more complicated than they were telling the public. There's also the issue of how modern warfare actually works. Experts on nuclear proliferation have long pointed out that programs like Iran's are deeply buried, heavily fortified, and spread across multiple sites. Analysts from places like the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Federation of American Scientists have said airstrikes alone rarely eliminate a nuclear program. Iraq, North Korea, and even Iran itself have demonstrated that facilities can be rebuilt, relocated, or hidden underground. That's why many security experts say bombing campaigns can delay programs, but they rarely erase them entirely. And the transparency problem matters because wars affect the public directly. Conflicts overseas often mean higher energy prices, defense spending increases, and long-term military commitments. Americans have historically demanded clear answers about what's happening and why, whether during Iraq, Afghanistan, or earlier conflicts. So the broader point supporting Bakari's side is that skepticism from journalists isn't about rooting against the country, it's about making sure the public isn't only hearing the most optimistic version of events from the people running the war. In a democracy, the press is supposed to ask uncomfortable questions, especially when the stakes involve military action, national security, and the truth about what's really happening on the ground.
Well, let me just
fact is,
strike you,
no one
because
has come out
the
and said
president,
that.
I believe it was the president who said that he believed it was not the U.S. that hit that hospital. When he asked Hegseth for confirmation, Hegseth said, it's being investigated, and he said, I want to point out Iran is the only people who target civilians. So he didn't say, no, we didn't do it, but he also didn't back up exactly what the president said. But Scott, certainly Pete Hegseth does not like any coverage which does not, mirror the administration line word for word.
Well, of course. And as you pointed out, administrations fight with the media about war and everything else. I do think that their point of view is that we are seeing before our eyes the most successful military campaign, the most efficient military campaign we could possibly have in recent memory, that this is the American military on full display in its full might, doing everything right and doing everything within its power to minimize casualties, even though it's war and unfortunate things are going to happen. And they've admitted that. And Hegseth did say, we're going to investigate this incident that Bakari referenced fully. But I think they feel like that the coverage of it, or at least the commentary around it, has been aimed at trying to portray this as some sort of a military failure, when in fact, it is a massive military success story right now. Look at what happened with the Great Lobster hoax of 2026. We had people going crazy about the idea that Hegseth was buying lobster and steak. Turns out he was sending it to the troops, which is military tradition. That's one example in a lot of other examples. But look, I tend to think that everybody here has responsibilities, and the government's transparency responsibilities, I personally think they're meeting. They're having regular briefings. Hegseth is answering questions. General Kane and other members of the military, the president's answering questions about it. But I think they've been actually pretty accessible to the media when it comes to asking questions and finding out about, how many targets are we hitting? How much of the enemy targets, have we destroyed? How many ships have we sunk? And so on and so forth. I don't think anybody's really having trouble getting access to the administration when it comes out to finding the facts, the actual facts about the prosecution of the war.
One thing that really strengthens Bakari's side of the argument here is the simple fact that wartime narratives from governments are often very different from what later investigations reveal. That's not unique to any one administration. It's happened under Republicans and Democrats alike. For example, during the Iraq War, early official briefings frequently described operations as more precise and successful than they later turned out to be once independent investigations and reports from humanitarian groups came out. There's also the issue of civilian casualties in modern air campaigns. Military planners often emphasize precision weapons, but even the most advanced targeting systems are not perfect. Reports from organizations like Air Wars and the UN have repeatedly shown that airstrikes in dense urban areas can produce far higher civilian casualty numbers than initial military estimates suggest. That's why journalists and independent groups continue to investigate incidents involving hospitals, schools, or residential areas, because the first official explanation is rarely the final one. Another important point is how information control works during active conflicts. Governments often release details that highlight successes, like targets destroyed or enemy capabilities weakened, while information about mistakes or unintended damage tends to emerge later through investigations, leaks, or outside reporting. That's not necessarily malicious, it's just how wartime messaging works. But it's exactly why independent scrutiny from reporters matters, and historically some of the most significant revelations about wars didn't come from official briefings at all. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal, for instance, only became widely known after journalists obtained photos and documents that weren't part of the government's initial narrative. Without that kind of reporting, the public might never have known the full story.